You know that feeling when you walk into a room to do something and immediately forget why you needed to be there in the first place? Yeah, I hate that feeling because when it happens, it means there was a version of me that existed not too long ago that knew why I had to be in that room. And in the span of less than a minute, that version of me, that person who I was mere moments prior, has died and can never come back. And sure, maybe if I'm lucky, I'll find something that reminds me of my purpose, but more often than not, I am left to stew in the uncomfortable reality that I have become someone new, that I have permanently lost that past version of myself, that I have changed, and not for the better. This is a video about death, decay, and growing up, and how they're all kind of the same thing.
God sent you wrapped in satin. Hey, stop pretending I'm the captain. But yesterday we looked down and said, every time we change, it's rain.
You wouldn't believe how long it took me to figure out that this and you are the same thing.
What do you mean?
You're both human. You have to admit it's a little confusing. You're big and can talk, and he's small and can only make noises. How was I supposed to know you were the same species?
I want to tell you about one of the scariest movies I watched as a kid. It's Click, the 2006 Adam Sandler movie.
We got the bong. You gotta have that bong.
The film has all of the expected thorny aspects of a Sandler production, like the gross-out humor and rampant sexism, yet that only makes it all the more surprising when the film drop-kicks you with some genuinely heartfelt and, as we'll later see, existentially terrifying drama. It follows a down-on-his-luck architect named Michael Newman who's trying to climb the corporate ladder to little success. One day, while trying to buy a universal remote at Bed Bath & Beyond because all the other actual electronics stores were closed, he stumbles across a hidden section of the store run by a strange, kooky, Doc Brown-like employee played by Christopher Walken. This employee, who introduces himself as Morty, ominously offers Michael a universal remote that he describes as, quote, the most advanced
piece of technology we have in this place.
and he's suspiciously willing to give this to Michael for free.
Booyah!
It turns out that the remote doesn't just control any TV, it also controls the very fabric of the universe.
You wanted a universal remote control. That remote controls your universe.
Yeah.
It grants Michael the ability to pause, fast forward, and rewind anyone and anything in the world. Any feature on the remote is applicable to real life. And as one would expect, he uses this power to engage in various acts of skullduggery. What a good word, skullduggery. He also uses it to optimize his life dramatically, as the remote allows him to essentially dissociate for hours or even years while his body goes on autopilot, an ability that's extremely appealing to a boring office worker like Michael. Eventually, much to Michael's dismay, the remote starts activating on its own. It has some sort of algorithm that allows it to fast forward automatically based on Michael's past preferences, which for a 2006 film is a concept that was pretty ahead of its time. It's at this point, when the remote starts acting on its own, that the film takes an unexpectedly dark turn. Michael unwittingly ends up fast-forwarding through a decade of his life, skipping through multiple heart attacks, a cancer diagnosis and subsequent cancer treatment, a liposuction, a divorce, and even the death of his own father. The scene in which he finds out he missed his father's funeral is one of my favorites in the film. It's one of the earliest displays of Adam Sandler's ability as a dramatic actor, and turns out, like many comedians, he's pretty damn good. Despite having missed some of the most important parts of his life, the parts that he was hoping the remote would help him enjoy, he at least manages to make it to his son's wedding, who has grown up into a disaffected young man embittered by hustle culture. During the ceremony, Michael suffers yet another heart attack, which, while not fatal, leaves him in a pretty rough state. While he recovers in the hospital with his now grown children beside him, he comes to the crushing realization that he may have wasted his entire life and passed his worst, most self-destructive tendencies onto his son. In a desperate final act, he leaves the hospital while still in the early stages of recovery, when he should be keeping physical activity to a minimum, and runs after his son and daughter to apologize and remind them how much he loves them, and to instill in his son one final lesson. Family comes first. And so, with that final message imparted to his kin, he passes away in the middle of the road, surrounded by his estranged family who, much like him, wished they had more time to know this distant man that they loved as equally as they resented. It is on this somber note that the film ends, demonstrating the destructive nature of work culture and how the capitalist grind can distract people from the most important parts of being alive.
Be glad.
Or so I remembered, but in fact, the film continues for another 6 minutes in an epilogue which reveals that the whole movie was a warning, a premonition designed to teach Michael the importance of cherishing life over status and wealth, very much like Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol.
Jesus Christ! Ebenezer Scrooge!
The man who gave Michael the remote was, in fact, the angel of death, and he decides to give Michael a second chance at life, confident that he has now internalized this lesson. So, with a new lease on life and a newfound sense of mortality, Michael is determined to do better by his family and ends the film ready to celebrate 4th of July with his wife and children. I watched Click once as a kid, and I enjoyed it well enough, but even I could tell how derivative and lowbrow the whole thing was. It did not endure in my mind, except for that moment at the end where Michael collapses to the ground and dies in his family's arms. Click is not particularly good, and even that scene is, looking back, kind of trite and cliche, especially in the context of its incredibly saccharine ending. But it's remarkable to think that the story could have ended there, with him dead in the middle of the road. Wouldn't that have been so powerful? That is the image from the film that has stuck with me all these years later. It was the first time I can remember really being confronted by my own mortality. It's not like I learned about death through Click. I understood the idea of dying and aging long before this, but I hadn't fully internalized the fact that those were things that were going to happen to me. I didn't think about how it would actually feel dying. I just knew vaguely that it would eventually happen to me someday. But the movie really made me confront the mechanism of dying, the slow process of it, the way it affects everyone around you. I saw my grandfather pass away when I was pretty young. My only interactions with the man consisted of staring at his crippled body in the hospital after he had his fatal stroke, which paralyzed half his body, rendered him mute, and eventually killed him. And so, partially because our interactions were so limited, and partly because he was an abusive asshole, and partly because I was a kid with a nascent sense of empathy, as I stood over his lifeless body and later his lifeless corpse, I felt nothing. He never had a proper funeral, the consequence of his lifetime of assholery. After he died, they unceremoniously laid his corpse on a gurney, naked, with nothing but a cloth covering him from the chest down. A handful of relatives showed up at the morgue. We gathered in a small semicircle around him. Someone started singing a song. My sister and I tried not to laugh at their embarrassingly off-key performance. All I could think about as I stared at his body, the first corpse I'd ever seen in real life, was how normal he looked. He didn't look how I thought a corpse would look. He was still like a person. I thought that a body devoid of a spirit would, in some metaphysical way, look distinctly inhuman. In truth, though, he was just stiff and a little pale. The stiffness was really the creepiest part. I kept waiting for something, some movement, a breath. I could almost convince myself he was sleeping, but there was no breath. I kept waiting. We left the room, and I still waited. Even as I looked death in the face, I had a hard time confronting the reality of it. It took a movie to dramatize the whole experience, to express it in cinematic language for me to realize not only that death sucks, but that aging is terrifying.
Here's a scary concept, though. Getting old. You can't do that.
As a kid, it was difficult for me to even fathom the concept of aging. So many of my friends were so excited about growing up, but for me, growing up didn't seem real. It beguiled my imagination. I understood on a basic level that the elders in my life were once my age, but they seemed so fundamentally different from me that it was hard to imagine that I, at like age 7, would eventually be that tall and confident and world-weary and different. But as I've gotten older, aging has become a much more real concept to me because I've witnessed its effects. I know it's weird for a 20-year-old to say, but I really do feel older. Not old, just older than I once was. I'm aware of the passage of time in a way I just wasn't at 7 years old, because at 7 years old, I didn't experience any change or loss, and that's what aging is really defined by. The death of my grandfather wasn't a loss because I never knew the man, so his absence left no impression because he was never a presence in my life to begin with. But you know whose death I did care about? The Queen's. I wasn't sad when I found out Queen Elizabeth died. It'd be kind of weird if I was. She lived a 96-year-long life of privilege. There was nothing tragic about her passing beyond the fact that her successor is a far more boring character and the memes have worsened in quality as a result. That's what I really cared about when the Queen died. How would it affect meme culture? The Queen was famously known, mimetically known, for being alive. Besides her fashion sense, that was kind of her most notable attribute. The whole joke was that she clearly must have been some kind of immortal vampire. And part of the joke was that it became a little more serious each passing year as she continued, somehow, to stay alive. And then she died, which ruined the gag. This joke from Megamind is now infinitely less funny. To be fair, the memes that came immediately after her passing were just exquisite. I haven't laughed as hard as I did in September 2022 in quite a while, but now that's all just a distant memory. There are people growing up today in a world where the Queen of England will have been dead for their entire life. They won't get these jokes, not really, not in the same way that we did. I know it's kind of silly to talk about memes in this way, but I think that's genuinely tragic. I'm now old enough to reminisce about things that no longer exist, like the Queen and One Direction. There's this great clip with Finn Wolfhard where an interviewer mentions that people on the internet have said that he could play a young Harry Styles, who famously was a part of One Direction, in case you haven't heard of it, and his co-star, who's about a decade younger than him, casually mentions that she's never heard of 1D, much to Finn's bewilderment.
One Direction biopic? Yeah, I kind of look like him. You don't like One Direction?
What? I haven't.
Oh, you don't know who they are?
No.
Well, Jesus, oh my God. You don't know who One Direction is? Wow.
For the record, Finn is only about 2 years younger than me. The generational gap has gotten wide enough that I can be snobby to kids growing up today about the stuff I did when I was young. Like, Roblox somehow is still relevant with children today, and I can't lie, I feel a little bit snobby about it because I played Roblox when I was a kid. I knew it was cool before they did, and that makes me better somehow. I remember Wizard 101 and Club Penguin and Pop Tropica, which is somehow still up, and Tim and Moby. Does anyone remember Tim and Moby? Everyone I grew up with knew about that stuff. I didn't realize that I'd eventually be living in a world where kids don't know about that, where that's not a universal part of suburban upbringing. I didn't realize I'd be so scared by that. The title of my generation, Gen Z, has an air of finality to it. And I guess I always assumed that my generation marked the end of history in one way or another. I guess I didn't think there was any more change left in life. I think the reason it was so hard for me to conceptualize growing up as a kid was because the first 10 odd years of my life were incredibly stagnant. From elementary to middle school, I lived in the same apartment complex, went to the same school district, and was surrounded by more or less the same group of kids. Small things changed, of course. Some kids moved, some places shut down, new places opened up, friendships dissolved, others blossomed, a grandfather died. I mean, things happened, but life had certain unchanging pillars. I would always have my childhood best friend and my big sister. I'd always live in the same state. I would always really be into anime, and I would always be terrible at school. Those were the pillars, and the pillars did not change. Until they did. One by one, these fundamentals of my life collapsed, sometimes simultaneously, and that terrified me. I spent the latter half of middle school and the first part of high school just filled with this vague yet all-encompassing dread. I was already a shy, nervous kid before, but the move just made everything worse. Everything except my grades. I actually became a much better student once I got into high school. Turns out, being in a new state with no friends and crippling anxiety made it pretty easy to focus on schoolwork, especially because it was basically the only thing in my life that provided me with much needed praise and affirmation. The improved GPA and slightly inflated sense of ego were small consolation prizes, though, in the face of some pretty terrible anxiety. A few months after the move, I had my first panic attack. I was in class, surrounded by a bunch of teenage boys who I was convinced would eviscerate me the moment they sensed any weakness in my heart. As I felt the fire ignite in my ribs, I frantically told my teacher that I needed to use the bathroom. I could barely contain the nervousness in my voice. In that school, there were no bathroom passes. To go to the bathroom, you had to let the teacher sign your agenda, which was given to every student at the beginning of the year, and note the time. This way, other teachers could see how often you, quote-unquote, used the bathroom and gauge whether or not you were just using it as an excuse to cut class. This would be the only time a teacher would sign my agenda. I didn't like using school bathrooms. Middle school boys are gross. And so, my teacher, a joyless man whose very presence seemed to darken the room, grabbed my agenda with all the urgency of a sloth eating a leaf, signed his name, and let me exit the classroom without a word. I fought the urge to run out the door, instead choosing to speed walk as inconspicuously as possible. I walked in the direction of the nearest bathroom, stopped about a quarter of the way through, and cried in the hallway. After a few minutes of that, I realized I should probably go back to class, but the idea of going back in there broke whatever composure I had gathered. All I could do was impotently sit in the fetal position. By sheer coincidence, my civics teacher happened to enter the hallway at the same time. She was a kind, cheerful woman who clearly found my passive disposition refreshing in a school filled with loud, obnoxious personalities. She saw me and immediately took me into her classroom, which was empty at the time, so I could compose myself. I did not compose myself. I ended up crying for a few more minutes and incoherently babbled about what caused my panic attack. It was embarrassing trying to explain the situation, especially with all the snot and tears dripping down my face. Thankfully, she had tissues. The real sucky thing about pain, mental or physical, is just how invisible it is. Sometimes, especially with physical pain, it is very visible and audible too.
You're gonna be okay!
But even the ways in which pain does physically manifest does not accurately capture the way pain feels, the way it can distort reality and time. No one can really understand another person's pain unless they experience it themselves. Our sympathy will always be limited by our ability to comprehend the scope of one's suffering. Talking to someone who's in pain is like talking to a stranger on the internet. It would be kind of foolish to trust everything they said. There's so many reasons why they would lie. As John Green said, pain is a reminder that you are alone inside your body,
that no one else can access your consciousness, and that what you call yourself is, at least in some ways, a kind of prison from which there is no earthly escape.
That's part of the reason why I love stories about unity, about people sharing each other's burdens. It's so comforting to see people come together, even under terrible circumstances. And that's why I love stories about the end of the world. After all, what could be more unifying than the fucking apocalypse? Whether it's nuclear, fungal, glacial, technological, biological, existential, extraterrestrial, or supernatural, the end of the world is just plain cool, no matter the cause. As a person who has, on multiple occasions, felt as though his anxiety might literally kill him, apocalyptic media is weirdly cathartic because it externalizes the devastation of the mind into something that's tangible. That's why my favorite part of any apocalyptic show is that moment the characters realize the world is ending and it's never coming back. Just seeing the way they respond to that is so cathartic in some weird, disturbing way. I think, surely we've all personally had moments like that where, in some small way, your world shattered completely. We each face individual apocalypses all the time. Even something as relatively minor as moving to a new city or state is kind of a paradigm shift that can be utterly overwhelming.
So, my current mental health is rapidly approaching an ATL, which is that's an all-time low, not Atlanta.
Bo Burnham's Inside is not a post-apocalyptic story in the traditional sense, but it is the story of a man trying to survive the aftermath of both a worldwide cataclysm and a personal struggle with anxiety. The special confronts the ways in which the external world has changed dramatically and how Bo's role as an artist has remained suspiciously stagnant, an idea which I think is best exemplified in the song 30. Part of what makes the physical process of aging so strange is that your physical development does not necessarily directly correlate with your mental development. As a person who will soon be turning 20 and facing his own existential dread from the mere idea of growing old, Bo's lament hits startlingly close to home. That's how you pronounce that word. The world and even our very own body changes at such an incredibly fast rate that we hardly have time to acclimate to it. Bo has evolved as an artist, yes, but he's also kept many of the destructive habits he criticized earlier in his career. Art is Dead denounced his selfish acclamation of wealth, and 10 years later, comedy does the same thing, indicating on some level Bo's staunch unwillingness to change. Even in the face of what felt like apocalyptic circumstances, Bo, like many of us, like myself, refused to substantially change. Inside is as much a reinvention of Bo's style as it is a return to form. And seeing him battle between those two conflicting desires, to grow but also to stagnate, is one of the most compelling and cathartic aspects of the special. Change is hard, and in a morbid way, it's kind of nice seeing people collapse in response to the terrifying and sudden changes of the world.
So I've been working on...
So sorry.
No, that's okay.
Is it alright if I scream?
What?
I'd like to scream.
Yeah, sure.
The Edge of Sleep is an audio drama and possibly soon-to-be TV show with a pretty unique type of apocalypse. The premise is that sleeping has suddenly become lethal overnight, killing most of the population within seconds. We follow a small band of survivors who attempt to cure the sleep epidemic, all the while fighting ever-increasing exhaustion and the violent pursuers they encounter along the journey. It's a unique, extremely well-acted and well-produced show that's only slightly brought down by the fact that another, admittedly far worse, show beat it to the punch.
Oh my God. Is it Christmas?
Rooster Teeth's ill-fated Day 5 premiered 3 years before The Edge of Sleep and took a more humorous approach to the idea of a sleep apocalypse. You can tell in the ways they approach the immediate aftermath of the apocalypse just how different both series are. For me, The Edge of Sleep is far superior for its higher production value and the sheer thoroughness of its depiction. Episode 2 details the first moments of the epidemic. We already know from the end of Episode 1 that shit is gonna hit the fan, but the opening moments of Episode 2 really let that reality simmer. Here's the scene. We follow 2 nurses doing an overnight shift on the 4th of July. Despite the holiday, the hospital is uncharacteristically quiet. The 2 nurses share fun banter. Both of them are nearing the end of their shift and are eager to go home and fall asleep. The foreshadowing is not subtle at all. They might as well beat you over the head with it, but that doesn't make it any less effective at building that sense of dread that makes your stomach drop.
Hi, John. It's Nurse Linda. This is Nurse Brittany. How are you feeling? John? Can you hear me? John? John? I'm not getting a response.
Can we get some help in here, please?
He's not breathing. I can't find a pulse. I've been getting compressions.
We have a code blue in room 1.
What I love about this episode is how much time they dedicate to those first few moments after everyone realizes what happens. There's no sudden jump cut to 4 hours later. We are forced to really feel the weight of the world collapsing. We have to sit with Linda as she tries doing chest compressions on a patient who died with no apparent cause. We hear the panic in the doctor and the nurse's voices as the EKGs flatline across the hospital. We hear Linda tell everyone to evacuate the building because she thinks there's been a chemical leak. I love that moment especially because it's the exact type of response a nurse would realistically make in that situation, and it gives the series that extra bit of verisimilitude. That's what's so compelling about those opening moments. It feels real. It doesn't detract from the situation with misplaced comedy or preemptive jump cut. everything is suddenly different, and the characters just have to live with that. Okay, let's talk about Steven Universe.
You look at everything you are. Look at everything you do. It's incredible as you and me.
Steven Universe is a series that profoundly believes in everyone's ability to change. Almost all of the conflicts in the series are resolved, essentially, with a conversation or a song, or both. The final episode of the original series is even called Change Your Mind, and it ends with a short tune that extends a hand to anyone willing to listen. The series controversially believed that anyone, even the worst, most heinous individuals, could change their ways if they wanted, with the exception of 2 characters who just refused to let that dog out.
You may have gotten us this time, but we'll be out there.
Hating you!
Forever!
You smell!
Every other antagonist, major or minor, experiences some sort of redemption because they are willing to change. The series' thesis is clear. It's never too late to change. But this is not an entirely positive thesis. The series acknowledges in both big and small ways that people can change for the worse. They can regress into monsters even after having made progress. This is shown with Amethyst's short rivalry with Jasper in Season 3, with Spinell's brief return to villainy in the movie, and repeatedly with Lapis, especially in Season 5, where she seemingly bails from the crystal gems when faced with a potential diamond invasion. I don't think any episode, at least in the original series, conveys the idea of negative change quite as dramatically as Catfingers.
That would have been a total catastrophe!
Catfingers is the 6th episode of Season 1, a time where the crew was still trying to figure out exactly what the show would be and how to introduce its world to the audience. Like, in the episode where we find out that the crystal gems are thousands of years old, Steven almost dies by aging too fast, in a scene that's remarkably similar to the end of Click.
I sincerely hope that nothing happens to... Oh, Steven! Are you trying to kill him faster?
In the episode where we learn about fusion for the first time, the show suddenly reveals that it's also a musical, which seems obvious in hindsight, but was probably a little jarring for the first-time viewer. It was just a trend in Season 1 that whenever really plot-relevant information was revealed, something weird or fucked up would happen, and Catfingers is no exception. While Episode 4 is the first time gem shape-shifting is shown, Catfingers is the formal introduction of the concept. The entire episode is based around it and whether or not Steven is capable of it as a human-gem hybrid. It turns out he is. Like, he really is. The episode begins with Amethyst teaching Steven the basics of shapeshifting, and he's eventually able to create little tiny cat heads on his fingers. It's cute. You'd expect that gradually, after going through several trials and tribulations, Steven would eventually learn to transform his entire body into a cat by the episode's end, signifying his growth as a person and capabilities as a crystal gem. And well, he kind of does that, but not of his own volition. The episode very quickly delves into full-on body horror as Steven hobbles over to his dad's car wash with cat heads bursting from his body as his cries for help are mixed over the sounds of meowing.
Help! The catfingers are taking over my body!
And there's a moment where Steven has to confront the fact that he very well might die, or at the very least be stuck as a cat monster for the rest of his life. And even though Greg eventually saves the day and the episode ends with Steven telling some stupid cat puns,
I'm feeling much better, meow!
the more you think about it, the more horrifying that situation becomes.
I'm a monster! I'm a monster!
more you think about Steven Universe as a whole, the more you realize that Steven went through a lot of shit, and it's kind of surprising that he's not more unstable. Then, Steven Universe Future happened.
How messed up is that? That I've gotten away with this for so long. You have no idea how bad I am. You think I'm so great and I'm so mature and I always know what to do, but that's not true. I haven't learned a thing from my problems. They've all just made me worse. I'm not that kid anymore. I'm a fraud. I'm a fraud.
Future takes the idea that anyone can change and puts a negative spin on it.
Adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma can have a lasting impact on how your body responds to stress.
This idea was toyed with a little in the original run, especially with the character Lapis, who, in comparison to her roommate Peridot, had quite a bumpy road to redemption. Throughout her character arc, she teetered from begrudging ally to scared victim to cold and uncaring misanthrope.
You almost drowned me when you tried to steal the world's water?
I almost drowned a lot of people.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man? She belongs to the streets.
It's this variance in her character that I think is partly to blame for her controversial status in the fandom. We never really got the catharsis of seeing her integrate with the crystal gems in the same way we did with Peridot. But despite my own misgivings with how she was handled, I think her character provided a pretty unflinching depiction of an abuse victim. Her dismissive attitude is not a deliberate unkindness, but an intentional defense mechanism, a way of keeping people from a distance. The way she interacts with Steven, the first person she learned to trust unconditionally in thousands of years, shows that she is capable of kindness, but is unsure of who is deserving of that kindness. Steven's defense mechanism is kind of the opposite. He has adapted to extend a kind hand to literally everyone he meets and has been actively rewarded for doing this. And as admirable as that is, it's taxing to constantly put the thoughts and feelings of others ahead of your own. Steven is the portrait of every chronic people-pleaser, and Future shows us what that people-pleasing does to a person. It hollows them out. But even after everything that happened, the show still embraces change wholeheartedly. If it's never too late to change, then that means even when you become a monster, you can, theoretically, turn back into something good, something new. Even if you carry the scars of the past, you can still blossom into something new. And that's what Steven does. Ultimately, the show concludes that Steven needs something different, something new and completely separate from the baggage of his mother and the gems. He isn't completely abandoning his past, rather he's building up from the foundations that were already laid so that he can blossom into something new and better. He needs to learn how to be human and, obviously, go to therapy. Speaking of characters who need to go to therapy,
don't see the life as a chore. Though the bed is gone, they're no longer sore.
I went into Arcane basically knowing only one thing about League of Legends, that Jinx was its most popular character. I had no expectations for the series, no awareness of it, no understanding of what it could even be. All I wanted was some beautiful animation and to see that little meek blue-haired girl become this eccentric, crazy, and presumably more interesting character. And, well, I got my wishes. But what I didn't expect was to find Powder to be an endearing and wholly compelling character on her own. As Act 1 drew to a close and I lay slack-jawed at one of the most emotionally affecting episodes of a TV series I'd ever seen, I realized that I didn't want Powder to become Jinx. Sure, it resulted in some really compelling character drama, but also hurt to see this pure, idealistic, if slightly unstable and codependent kid have their world shattered because of a terrible, terrible mistake. I found the relationship between Jinx and Vi to be the most compelling aspect of the series, and season 1 ends with a confrontation between the two that permanently changes the nature of their relationship. The idea that Jinx could return to being Powder is dangled in the air several times, but the audience and even the characters in the show understand that there's no going back. Powder fell down a well. She was jinxed from the start. At a certain point, it felt almost delusional to ignore this change. To pin Jinx's descent on Silco or even on Vi ignores her own agency in the matter. In the end, she chose this, a fact which is best exemplified in her final act of the season, one that was unprompted, unnecessary, and actively counterproductive. Yet it's also oddly triumphant. Jinx's arc is a perverted kind of self-actualization. Yes, she's descended into madness, but she's also focused her chaotic, destructive tendencies into something precise and powerful. Powder died and Jinx rose from the ashes by necessity. Piltover is the city of progress, after all, which is just another way of saying it's a city of change. And that is one of the eminent themes of Arcane, the tragically inevitable and irreversible nature of change. There is perhaps no other story that embraces change quite so enthusiastically and extravagantly as JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The series was designed to be a eulogy to humanity, according to its creator Hirohiko Araki, so it only makes sense with such a grand mission statement that the series is an intercontinental, multi-generational epic that deals with several varied characters, themes, and even universes. The series is unafraid of change, and this is exemplified in its treatment of the concept of fate. In fiction, fate has classically been used to accentuate the tragedy of a plot, to attribute a level of inherent cruelty to the universe. But JoJo's embraces the quite optimistic idea that, in the end, fate will ultimately act in favor of the righteous. Even if everything is predetermined, even if evil may prevail temporarily, Araki firmly believes that karma will balance the scales and eventually punish the wicked. Therefore, fate is not a malicious force to be feared, and it should not dictate how one lives their life. It is the characters that ignore this fact and seek to control fate for their own selfish reasons who ultimately suffer the worst consequences. Part 5's primary antagonist Diavolo illustrates this best. Of JoJo's many iconic villains, he arguably holds the title for having suffered the most brutal defeat of all. He is one of the few main antagonists not to die at the end of their part. Instead, he is forced to suffer an infinite death loop for all of eternity, thanks to the recursive powers of Gold Experience Requiem. He's essentially thrown into hell, which, for a guy named after the devil, feels fitting. I think Kellen Goff's performance in the English dub really sells just how messed up this is.
What did you... A common hoodlum couldn't possibly be my undoing. That doesn't make any sense.
People have questioned whether Diavolo's actions warranted such a severe punishment. He definitely ranks among JoJo's more heinous characters, but compared to attempted child rapist Funny Valentine, serial killer Kira, and the sheer tapestry of evil that was Dio, Diavolo just being a ruthless gangster with a compulsion for filicide seems comparatively minor. But in the world of JoJo, he committed the greatest sin. He tried to overcome fate. His entire character revolved around preventing inevitable change. He attempted to move beyond his past by erasing all traces of it, but in doing so, he only managed to be entirely defined by it, and for that, he is subject to a truly hellish existence of not only eternal pain, but worse yet, stagnation. In a way, that's the most tragic aspect of his fate, the inability to grow, change, or develop. I spend the majority of my day sitting in the same room, in the same chair, on the same desk, using the same computer, and doing the same things. Ever since I left high school, and especially since I started doing college online, I've become increasingly sedentary and inactive. For a while, I was fine with this predicament. I went outside enough that my extended bouts of isolation were, to an introvert like myself, tolerable. In many ways, my evolution into a slight homebody was ideal, but now, facing a newfound period of social isolation, reignited anxiety, and existential angst as I approach my 20th birthday, I wish my day-to-day wasn't so still. When my mind is so antsy and eager to move, the dullness of mundanity almost feels mocking, foreboding. Rio Romeo is an artist I stumbled upon early in their career during the, oh, well, we sure have been stuck in our homes for quite a while, haven't we, part of the pandemic. They drew me in with their homegrown aesthetic, their authentic Penelope Scott-like vocal delivery, their queer lyrics, and especially their out-of-tune piano. Almost all of their songs, much like the best part of Adele's discography, consist of nothing but their voice and an acoustic piano, an artistic choice born partly out of necessity, as they suffered a pretty severe skateboarding accident in October of 2020, which damaged their brain, making them extremely sensitive to electronics. So to make music during this time, they had to develop an intimate relationship with the instrument, a relationship they cite as being instrumental to their recovery. As a fellow queer piano-loving musician, seeing Rio's work explode in popularity throughout the years has been really cathartic in a vicarious way. I still find the tender romance of Butch for Butch endlessly endearing, and I'm still bewildered by how underrated Danke Schoen and Soft Bitch are, but I understand why Nothing's New has taken the spot for their most popular song at the moment. It is a profound exploration of the poison that is stagnation. As Mabel Pines once so wisely said, romance is like gum. Nothing's New describes the uncomfortable reality of chewing a piece of gum that has long since lost its flavor. The singer of the song pleads with their partner to admit the cruel fact that it's not going to work out between them. Even if it hurts to admit, it won't hurt as much as being stuck in a stalemate with such a stale mate. That's such a stupid pun.
Nothing's new, nothing's new, nothing's new, nothing's new, nothing's new.
But there is a reason why people suffer the indignity of stagnation, why we keep chewing pieces of gum that are flavorless. There's a reason why people are complacent. Because it's easy. I would know. I want to embody the idea of a rebellious, adventurous teen, partly because I was so obedient to a fault during my actual teenage years, but in truth, I'm one complacent motherfucker, and I always have been. As the years have gone by, I've only become more sentimental about the now, the current moment, because I know how fleeting it can be. Part of me desperately wants to cling onto the present, even if it's not great, because at least it's familiar.
Like when I started sort of healing my anxiety more and more, I got afraid of it going away. because I was
it's a
like,
comfort blanket. It's
yes,
been there for so long.
It's a toxic, stinking, dirty comfort blanket.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
There's a safety in it. There's
Mhm.
like, I don't know what life is like outside of this. What if when I let go of this, it all falls apart? This is the thing that's keeping it all together.
The idea that the me that is saying these words right now, the me who is sitting at this desk and typing on this computer, will one day become a distant memory in the mind of another me, is a little haunting. The idea that I will one day be replaced by a man who resembles me, who possesses the same name as me, and who has many of the same memories and characteristics as me, but is nevertheless a stranger with new memories and new opinions and an older body, is on some existential level a little frightening. Thanks to the cloud and ever-expanding storage capacity, it is now very feasible for us to save a record of pretty much everything. Every fanfic we've written, every picture we've taken, every book we've bought, every album we've listened to. Jacob Geller made a wonderful video on the subject, aptly titled, "How Can We Bear to Throw Anything Away?", which shows some of the extreme lengths people will go in the sake of preservation, and the unfortunate cases in which no one made any effort to preserve vital artifacts. Don't we all, to some extent, want to prevent or impede or delay death? And what is change if not the death of the past? Is it no wonder that some, including myself, have this intense desire to preserve past versions of themselves? I feel this immense debt to the younger me's. I mean, they're the ones who got me here after all. Don't I owe it to them to keep their memory alive? Maybe. But part of growing up as a person is shedding the older versions of yourself, of moving past the past, of not holding on. Let memories be memories and fade over time. We will not last forever, and at some point we have to come to peace with our own temporality.
You're supposed to change. You're never the same, even moment to moment. You're allowed and expected to invent who you are. What an incredible power. The ability to grow up.
As much as I want to hold on, part of me is excited about letting go. I love the idea that I can change, but I hate the idea that I must change. And you must change. You cannot stay the same. Time's arrow neither stands still nor reverses. It only marches forward. There's something very scary about that, though. There's a fear that I may never get my footing again. But humans are adaptable. I'm adaptable. As Anna Fusco so eloquently wrote, I don't need to soothe myself into detachment. I don't need to protect myself from hurt. Devastate me, baby. I trust I'll know what to do.
So scared. All the time. Fear hurts. Feeling like everything is over. Was over long before I got here. So long. Hiding or trying to outrun this. Get it. This won't stop. Until I die. But when I die, I want it to hurt.
When you stare at a screen too long, when you say the same words over and over, when you sit down for too long, when you do the same thing too many times, things start to get weird. The body was meant to grow. When you limit your own growth, your mind will fight against it because there's something sort of hellish about monotony. It's hard for things to feel real when you get into a routine, at least for me. So going through these massive changes remind me that the world exists, that I exist, that other people exist, and that things are happening that matter and have consequence. And so whether it's in fiction or reality, I really love when things change, even for the worse. It's invigorating when things are changing around you, like when you're in a car staring out the window, seeing the scenery blur past you, feeling the movement of the car. It's just calming, weirdly enough. And it reminds me that I'm human, that I'm alive, that I'm breathing and mutating and shifting constantly. That's why, as much as I hate to admit it, something about COVID was kind of nice for me. It helped me grow.
When my friends leave, when I have to let go, this entire town is wiped off the map. I want it to hurt. Bad. I want to lose. I want to get beaten up. I want to hold on till I'm thrown off and everything ends. And you know what? Until that happens, I want to hope again. I want it to hurt. Because that means it meant something. It means something at least. Pretty amazing to be something at least.
Life is about changing and adapting and growing and decaying. Life is meant to be cataclysmic, to be catastrophic. Life is meant to hurt. And we have to try and enjoy the hurt, as fucked up as it is, because at least the pain reminds you that it's real. There's not always a good reason for it. There's no moral to be found, no lesson to be learned from pain, except that we're here for now, and we'll be gone in an instant, like a memory. And it'll hurt. It'll really fucking hurt. But we must want it to hurt. Oh, hi there. You made it to the end of this video. Wow, thank you. I appreciate it. This has been my longest video project to date. You know, it's nearly an hour long. I think if I add this segment into the video, it might actually be like 60 minutes. So yeah, if you made it through all of that, I really do appreciate it. I know time is money and time is scarce, so it's quite nice to think that someone would dedicate their precious life to watching my video. So yeah, thanks. And yeah, just thank you to just my friends and my family in general. Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for tolerating me, and I hope you continue to tolerate me. That's all for me. I'll be back in a month with more trash.